I knew the air in that conference room had changed the second the door opened. He walked in like he owned the place, loud laugh, cheap cologne, the kind of handshake that squeezes just long enough to make you wonder if it's a threat. "Name's Brandon," he said, like it was supposed to mean something to me. In my 18 years here, I'd seen my fair share of puffed-up middle managers come and go, but this one had a particular kind of smirk, like he already knew whose neck he was stepping on first. I'd been with the company since I was 23, starting at the bottom, working through long nights, fixing other people's mistakes while they took the credit, and somehow managing to avoid the political crossfire. I didn't climb the ladder by shaking hands. I built my place here by keeping my head down and delivering results nobody else could. The board knew me. The veterans in the office knew me. Hell, even the interns learned quick. If you wanted something done right, you brought it to me. I wasn't flashy, I wasn't loud, but I was reliable, solid as concrete. That's why, when this guy showed up talking about fresh blood and new energy, I felt that first crack in my guarded optimism. I've heard the phrases before. They usually translate to "your old news. We want you gone." It's funny. 97% of the people who listen to stories like this don't even subscribe. Just a tap, and you're in the crew. Seriously, it's like giving a nod to the guy who's been quietly holding the roof up over your head. Makes a hell of a difference for the team keeping these stories coming. Anyway, back to Brandon, the self-appointed savior of a company that wasn't asking to be saved. He came from some other firm in the city, supposedly with vision, though from what I'd heard, that vision mostly involved burning bridges and then charging people to cross the ashes. First week in, he held a meeting where he pitched ideas that were just recycled memos from projects I'd done 5 years ago without a single acknowledgement. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, flipping through the handout he'd printed in glossy color like it was a masterpiece, wondering how long it would take before the shine wore off him, and he realized the walls here weren't as easy to knock down as he thought. In the meantime, the office started shifting. The easy camaraderie I'd had with colleagues started to thin. Meetings I'd always been in suddenly slipped their mind when sending invites. Projects I'd been leading were reallocated to newer staff under the guise of broadening skill sets. I knew the language. I'd been on the safe side of it before. This time, I was the target. Brandon would drop little digs during calls, stuff like, "We'll get someone with a more modern approach on this," or "Let's not get stuck in the old ways." Always with a smile, always just enough plausible deniability to make HR roll their eyes if I complained. Still, I kept my work spotless. If he wanted to edge me out, I'd make sure he had to climb over a wall of results to do it. But every day, that unease crept in a little more. It wasn't just the changes, it was the way people looked at me now, like I had some invisible expiration date stamped on my forehead. Even people I'd mentored years ago seemed hesitant to be seen standing too close to me in the break room. Then one afternoon, while clearing out an old cabinet in my office, one I'd been meaning to go through since before Brandon showed up, I found it. A leather binder, worn and heavy, the spine creased from decades of sitting untouched. The initials embossed on the cover made me stop cold. My father's. I hadn't seen it in years. My father had been a part of this company before it was even the company we knew today. He'd sold part of it during a merger back in the early 80s, before I was even out of high school. I sat down, the office suddenly too quiet, and flipped it open. Inside were contracts, stock agreements, handwritten notes in my father's tidy block letters. It smelled faintly of paper and dust, like an attic holding something important no one had looked at in decades. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but there was something in the way my father had tucked certain pages behind others, certain lines highlighted in yellow so faint it had almost faded away. I closed it after a few minutes, not ready to dig further, but a thought lodged itself in the back of my mind like a splinter. My father never kept things without reason. And if he'd left this here in my office all these years, maybe it wasn't just nostalgia. Maybe it was a warning. I didn't know it yet, but that binder was the first domino. Everything that followed, the smirk, the termination, the boardroom silence, it all started the moment my fingers brushed across that cracked leather cover. And somewhere in that mess of legal jargon and yellowed paper was the fuse I didn't even realize I was about to light. It started like a slow leak, quiet enough that you can almost convince yourself you're imagining it, until one day the carpet squishes under your feet. The first forgotten meeting was with a major client I'd personally brought in 8 years ago. I found out about it because I happened to pass the conference room and saw Brandon in there, gesturing like he was pitching the moon, with two junior analysts sitting beside him taking notes. My name never came up in the meeting summary email that went out afterward. The next week, a project I'd been leading for months, something already halfway to completion, was suddenly reassigned to a kid fresh out of grad school. The official reason? We think it's a great opportunity for him to grow into leadership. Unofficially, Brandon didn't want me visible on a win that big. It's a classic move. Pull someone out midstream so the credit goes to whoever happens to be standing in the right spot at the finish line. I bit my tongue and kept showing up. That's the thing about professionalism, You keep it together even when your stomach's doing flips and your blood pressure could pop an air hose. But the real sting wasn't the meetings or the reassignments. It was the sideways glances from people I'd trusted for years. The cautious tone when they asked me how things were going. The way conversations shifted when I walked up, as if being too friendly might put their own necks under the blade. Then came the meeting that really sealed it for me. We were in the main conference room, discussing a supply chain issue that had been plaguing us for months. I had the solution. It wasn't even complicated, just a matter of timing certain orders differently to avoid bottlenecks. Brandon let me explain for all of 30 seconds before cutting me off with a chuckle. Yeah, that's one of those old school approaches. We've moved past that kind of thinking. He looked at the junior staff like they were in on the joke, as if I were a relic from some forgotten office era when people still used typewriters and rotary phones. A couple of them laughed, not because it was funny, but because they were smart enough to laugh when the boss made a joke. On the outside, I smiled and nodded, even made a little fair enough gesture like I was happy to defer. On the inside, something twisted. It wasn't just the humiliation, it was the knowledge that this wasn't going to stop. I'd seen it happen to others, the slow stripping of responsibilities, the rewrites of history where you never really contributed anything, the erasure from the company's living memory. That night, after everyone had gone home, I stayed late under the guise of catching up. I wasn't catching up, I was sorting through my office. Maybe it was the creeping paranoia, maybe just instinct, but I wanted to make sure anything that mattered to me left with me if things went south. That's when I opened the bottom drawer of the old filing cabinet, one I hadn't touched in years except to toss in the occasional outdated budget printout, and found it again. The leather binder, heavy, cracked along the spine, still smelling faintly of dust and old ink. I remembered flipping through it briefly when I'd first found it weeks ago, but I hadn't dug into it. Now, with the office empty and the hum of the vending machine as the only background noise, I slid it out and set it on my desk. The first page was a letter from my father to the original board, typed on yellowing paper. The tone was formal but firm, the way a man writes when he knows exactly what he's giving up and exactly what he's keeping. Behind it were thick contracts, merger clauses, stock agreements, all from the early 1980s. His handwriting appeared here and there, underlining certain words, circling phrases in red pen. And then I saw it, half a page highlighted so lightly the yellow had nearly disappeared. The legal language was dense, the kind that makes your eyes glaze over. But a few words jumped out at me: termination without cause, reversion, controlling interest. I didn't understand it fully yet, but the weight of it hit me in the chest. My father had been a stubborn man, careful, methodical. He didn't leave anything to chance. If he'd gone through the trouble of having this printed, highlighted, and stored in my office all these years, it meant something. I sat there long after the cleaning crew came through, flipping pages under the desk lamp, the clock ticking louder in the quiet. By the time I slid the binder back into my bag, I knew one thing for sure. Brandon thought he was writing the final chapter of my story here. But something in these pages told me he might just be setting up my next move. For a couple of weeks, I told myself to just ride it out. 18 years in, I was close enough to retirement that I figured I could grit my teeth, keep my head down, and let the storm blow past. I'd seen bad managers before. Usually they burned bright, flamed out, and left behind a smoking crater for someone else to fix. Brandon would be no different, I told myself. I'd just have to be patient. Some friends, old colleagues who'd moved on to other companies, weren't buying it. Over beers one Friday night, one of them leaned in and said, "Man, you need to lawyer up. This guy's not just trying to sideline you, he's building a paper trail to justify it." I waved him off. It's fine. I've been here longer than he's been in the industry. I'll outlast him. Saying it out loud made me feel like I had some kind of control, but the truth was, I could already feel the walls pressing in. Back at the office, Brandon's little campaign started picking up speed. He wasn't content with stripping me out of projects, now he was planting seeds. In a staff meeting, while discussing an upcoming product rollout, he said, "We've had some issues with people hoarding responsibilities, which slows us down." He didn't look at me, but he didn't have to. Everyone knew who he meant. The word hoarding stuck in my head like a splinter. In a single breath, he'd painted me as selfish, outdated, and an obstacle to progress. I kept my mouth shut, not because I agreed with him, but because I knew how this game worked. The more defensive you sound, the more guilty you look. But silence didn't help. Next week, I overheard two mid-level managers whispering in the hallway about a strategic reorg. They dropped their voices when I passed, but not before I caught the tail end, mostly targeting the veterans. Veterans, that was the polite way of saying the people making more money than we think they're worth. I'd been loyal for almost 2 decades, and now that loyalty had a dollar sign attached to it, a big one. The thing is, I still believed I could weather it. I thought if I just stayed useful enough, visible enough, they'd realize I was worth keeping. That maybe Brandon would focus his attention on someone else. It was denial, plain and simple, dressed up as pragmatism. Every time I reached for the binder at home, thinking maybe I should really dig into those contracts, I stopped myself. That was for people who had already given up, and I wasn't ready to admit I was one of them. Meanwhile, small humiliations kept stacking. Brandon started CCing junior staff on emails that should have gone directly to me, as if I needed supervision. He'd forget to include me on invites, then act surprised when I wasn't in the room. During one all-hands call, he talked about modernizing our leadership culture and dropped a line about phasing out legacy thinking. My phone lit up with texts from old colleagues. "He's talking about you." Each time, I swallowed the hit and kept going. I told myself it was temporary, but the truth was the balance had shifted. This wasn't just about a personality clash, it was about clearing the path for whatever vision Brandon had for this place. And people like me weren't part of that vision. I'd walk the halls now and feel eyes on me, not with respect, but with calculation. Who's next? How long before his name is off the door? Same people who used to stop by my office for advice now barely linger in the doorway. It was like watching my own relevance bleed out in real time. That old binder sat on my desk at home, the leather growing more worn every time I slid it aside instead of opening it. I wasn't ready yet. Not because I didn't think it mattered, but because once I did, there'd be no pretending anymore. It would mean admitting that my career here, this place I'd given my youth to, wasn't something I could just quietly hold on to. And for a man who'd built his life around outlasting storms, that was a truth I wasn't ready to face. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of bland, forgettable day you never expect to mark the rest of your life. I was halfway through replying to an email when my phone rang. The caller ID just said HR. Before I could even process it, a clipped voice on the other end told me, "Can you come down to conference room B? Now." No explanation, no context, just the flat, mechanical tone of someone who's read the script too many times. The moment I stepped through the door, I knew exactly what this was. Brandon was already there, leaning back in his chair like he'd just won something on a game show. Next to him sat the HR rep, a legal pad in front of her, and a pen held like she was afraid it might bite her. "Have a seat," Brandon said, his voice smooth, rehearsed. He waited just long enough for the silence to turn sharp before he leaned forward, that smirk stretching wider. "You should be thanking us," he said, as if this was some sort of favor. Then he slid a neat stack of papers across the table. "Your termination package." The HR rep started reading from her notes, but I wasn't listening. I kept my eyes on Brandon, watching how much he enjoyed this little performance. The arrogance in his posture, the way he kept glancing at the clock like he had better things to do. He'd wanted this moment since the day he walked in, and now he had it. I didn't argue. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a scene. I took the pen, signed where they told me to sign, and pushed the papers back across the table. "Anything else?" I asked, my voice so steady it almost startled me. Brandon blinked just once like he'd been expecting me to snap. Back in my office, I closed the door and started packing. Photos, a few personal books, the framed thank you card from a project team years ago, and the binder, that heavy, cracked leather binder sitting in the corner of my bookshelf like it had been waiting for this exact day. I slipped it into my bag without a second thought. Walking out felt strange, not like I was leaving, but like I was moving through the first page of something I didn't fully understand yet. The elevator ride down was silent, the lobby unusually bright, almost sterile. No one looked at me. No one said goodbye. It was as if I'd already been erased. At home that night, I set the box from my office on the kitchen table and pulled the binder out. I didn't bother with dinner. I just poured myself a drink, sat down, and opened it to the section where my father's handwriting clustered in the margins. That's when I saw it, half a page buried deep in the original merger agreement. The text was dry, dense, the kind of thing lawyers write to make sure only other lawyers can truly appreciate it. But there it was, a clause I'd never noticed before, lightly highlighted, almost faded with age. Upon termination without cause of my full name, 51% of company stock shall revert to the family name trust. I read it twice. Then again, my pulse picked up. My father had negotiated this decades ago, before Brandon, before the current CEO, before half the people in that building were even out of grade school. It had been sitting there in black and white all these years, waiting for the exact moment someone like Brandon would walk in and think they'd won. Controlled rage settled into something colder. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. For the first time that day, I felt the balance tilt, just a fraction, back in my direction. And as I sat there in the quiet, the papers spread out in front of me, a decision began to take shape. The next morning, I dug through my phone until I found a number I hadn't dialed in over a decade. Arthur Whitman, my father's old corporate lawyer. The man was practically part of the family in the 80s, spent more time in our living room than some of our relatives, usually with a briefcase at his feet and a scotch in his hand. I'd heard he'd retired to a lakeside cabin up north, but when he picked up on the second ring, his voice was as sharp as I remembered. "Arthur, it's me," I said. "We need to talk. It's about the old merger." There was a pause, then a faint chuckle. "I was wondering when you'd call. We met that afternoon at a small diner halfway between my place and his." Arthur walked in wearing a tweed jacket that probably hadn't been in style since the Reagan administration, but he carried himself like a man who never cared about trends to begin with. I slid the binder across the table before the waitress had even brought the coffee. He put on a pair of half-moon reading glasses, flipped to the highlighted section, and grinned in that slow, knowing way lawyers do when they're about to drop a hammer. I remember this clause. Your father fought tooth and nail for it. Nearly tanked the deal over these words right here. He tapped the page with one finger. Termination without cause triggers reversion of controlling interest, 51% directly to the family trust. Not you personally, mind you, but the trust. And that still stands, I asked. My voice felt too loud in the quiet diner. It stands, he said simply. They'd have to prove cause, and from what you've told me, they didn't even try. They thought you'd just go quietly. He leaned back, a spark in his eye. That was their mistake. I sat there for a moment, trying to reconcile the gravity of what he was saying. 51% wasn't just influence, it was control. It meant board seats. It meant the power to hire and fire at will. It meant Brandon's smirk could be wiped off his face in about 5 seconds. But Arthur's smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. You need to understand something. This will be a bombshell. When we drop this in front of them, they won't just roll over. They'll fight like cornered animals. Dig into your past, your finances, hell, they might even try to paint you as incompetent after the fact just to save face. And you can expect the CEO to bring in the kind of lawyers who bill more in an hour than most people make in a month. I nodded slowly. Cautious hope was starting to creep in, but so was a healthy dose of reality. This wasn't going to be some clean, surgical strike. It would be messy, public, and personal. Arthur closed the binder, slid it back to me, and lowered his voice. The good news? This clause was buried so deep I'd be surprised if anyone in current leadership has ever even read it. We filed it as part of the original shareholder agreement, and it's been collecting dust in some archive box ever since. That means we have the element of surprise. And trust me, in corporate law, surprise is worth more than gold. We spent the next 2 hours mapping out the first steps. Arthur would pull the original signed copies from his own records. He kept everything, a habit my father had both mocked and appreciated. I'd stay quiet, let the company believe I was licking my wounds, while he prepared the legal notice. Timing was everything. We needed them to be vulnerable, distracted, preferably already scrambling over some unrelated problem. As we shook hands in the parking lot, Arthur gave me one last piece of advice. They took your job thinking that was the end of the story. Don't let them realize it's only the beginning until it's too late. Driving home with the binder on the passenger seat, I felt something I hadn't felt since Brandon's first week in the building: control. Not total control, not yet, but the shape of it was there, waiting. And for the first time since I'd walked out of that HR meeting, I allowed myself to imagine what it might feel like to sit on the other side of the table, with the pen in my hand. 2 days later, the company posted the announcement. Short, clinical, and cold, exactly the kind of PR sanitized execution Brandon would be proud of. After 18 years of service, my name has decided to part ways with the company to pursue other opportunities. We thank him for his contributions, but in the evolving landscape of our industry, fresh perspectives are essential for continued growth. If you've ever read one of these, you know what it really means. We pushed him out, and we want you to believe it's because he couldn't keep up. The final line was the kicker. We wish him the best of luck in his future endeavors. Nothing says you were dead weight like that tired phrase. They even let the whispers do their work. Performance issues. Couldn't adapt. Out of touch. Brandon didn't need to plant those ideas in people's heads. The statement was designed to water them. A few old colleagues reached out with awkward messages, half sympathy, half curiosity. I gave them nothing. I said nothing publicly. Not to the press, not on social media, not even in the quiet conversations that started to swirl in the industry. I let their version of events hang in the air, unchallenged. Because the more they believed I was gone, the deeper the trap would be when Arthur and I dropped the truth. While the official story circulated, I went to work in silence. Every morning, I sat at my kitchen table with coffee and the binder, taking notes. I pulled old annual reports, SEC filings, and archived shareholder lists, anything that could confirm the current ownership structure and prove how devastating a 51% reversion would be. I cross-referenced board meeting minutes with financial disclosures, looking for stress fractures, declining revenue in certain divisions, unexplained expenses, leadership turnover in key departments. One particularly interesting detail jumped out. 2 major clients had quietly ended contracts in the last quarter, but it hadn't been publicly disclosed yet. The losses were big enough to rattle investor confidence if word got out. I didn't need to leak anything. I just needed to know where the cracks were forming. Arthur was in the background, moving like a ghost through legal channels. He had the original signed document scanned and certified, and he was drafting the official notice of reversion. His only instruction to me: keep your head down. Don't poke the bear until we're ready, so I played the role. The quietly discarded veteran, the man nursing his wounds in private. I took calls from recruiters, pretended to be exploring options, kept my voice casual when anyone brought up the company. All the while, I kept a growing folder labeled boardroom ammo. Then, one Thursday morning, my phone buzzed with a text from an old friend still inside. Emergency board meeting called for next Tuesday. Topic: financial stability. I sat back in my chair, letting the words sink in. Financial stability. It was corporate speak for panic. If they were pulling the board together without warning, it meant something had spooked them, maybe a client walking, maybe an investor making noise. Either way, it was exactly the kind of moment Arthur had told me to wait for. I pictured Brandon in that room, confident he'd buried me under a narrative of obsolescence, completely unaware that the fuse was already burning toward him. And for the first time since this began, I didn't just feel calm, I felt anticipation. The hurt was gone. The humiliation was gone. All that remained was the cold, surgical focus of someone who knows the exact day and hour his enemies will realize they made the worst mistake of their careers. The morning of the meeting felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, toes hanging over the drop, waiting for the wind to decide which way you'd fall. Technically, I wasn't part of the company anymore. My badge was dead, my email long since locked, but Arthur had every legal right to represent the family trust. That was the loophole, a quiet little back door my father had left open decades ago. We'd agreed I wouldn't go in, not yet. Let the documents speak first. Let the shock land before they saw my face. So I waited in the hallway outside the boardroom, pacing slow, measured steps over carpet that muffled everything except the pounding in my chest. Through the closed double doors, I could hear the low thrum of voices, board members talking over one another, the sharp interjections of the CFO, the clipped, careful tone of the company's in-house counsel. This was no ordinary meeting. They were in crisis mode and they didn't know the real bomb hadn't even gone off yet. Then I heard it, the creak of hinges as the door opened, followed by a sudden hush. Arthur didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He just walked in, his presence like a cold draft in the middle of their warm little panic session. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying with that mix of courtroom confidence and absolute calm. He didn't wait for permission. He set his leather briefcase on the table, flipped the clasps, and pulled out the original merger agreement, yellowed edges, crisp signatures, and the highlights still faintly glowing after all these years. He didn't give them a speech. He didn't explain why he was there. He simply placed the document in the center of the table, adjusted it so it was facing the CEO, and stepped back. From my spot outside, I couldn't see, but I could picture it perfectly. The CEO, impatient, leaning forward to glance at the first page, flipping once twice, scanning in that quick, dismissive way people read things they assume won't matter. And then silence. Even through the door, I felt the pause. It was heavy, almost physical, the way the air shifts when someone realizes they've just stepped into something they can't back out of. In my mind, I could see the exact moment his eyes landed on the clause, the words my father had fought for, the trigger they had just pulled without even knowing it. Arthur said something then, low, deliberate, but I couldn't make out the words. I imagined he was clarifying for the record, making it impossible for anyone in that room to pretend they didn't understand. My pulse was hammering so hard it felt like it was in my throat. I started pacing again, each pass by the boardroom door making me wonder if I should just push it open, walk in, and watch it happen. But no, timing mattered. I wanted them to sit with it, to let the weight of those 51% sink in before they saw me. A minute later, I heard the CEO's voice. Not the confident, clipped tone he used at investor calls, but something lower, thinner. "Is this verified?" Arthur's reply came through clear, firm, final, signed, sealed, and enforceable. The room went quiet again. Somewhere in that silence, I knew the balance of power had shifted. They didn't know what my next move was. They didn't know if I'd come for their jobs, their deals, or their entire control of the company. But I knew. And in that hallway, heart pounding, hands steady, I felt the first real taste of victory. Arthur didn't rush. That was his style. Let the tension build until the room is hanging on the pause between words. I could hear the faint scrape of his chair as he stood, the shuffle of paper as he lifted the document. His voice was steady, formal, each syllable deliberate. "For the record," he began, "I will now read the relevant clause from the original merger agreement dated March 14, 1983. The room was so quiet I could make out the faint hum of the HVAC through the closed door. And then he spoke the sentence that my father had buried in that contract like a landmine, waiting for the day someone was arrogant enough to trigger it. Upon termination without cause of, he said my full name, middle included, the way it would appear in court, 51% of company stock shall revert to the family name trust. Silence. A clean, absolute silence that didn't feel like contemplation. It felt like impact. Somewhere in that stillness, I heard it, the clatter of a pen hitting the tabletop, quick and sharp, like someone's grip had gone slack. I pictured the board members looking at one another, the math already clicking into place. 51% wasn't influence. It wasn't just a vote. It was ownership, control. In that moment, the company was no longer theirs. It was mine. Arthur let the words sit there, heavy and undeniable, before adding, "The triggering event occurred last week when my client was terminated without cause. This transfer is immediate and binding under corporate law and the company's own charter." That was when the murmuring started, low, frantic, overlapping voices. In my mind, I could see them. The CFO leaning toward the CEO, whispering fast. The head of legal flipping through his notes like maybe, just maybe. there was some magic loophole to claw this back. One of the outside directors already pulling out his phone under the table to text someone. But the CEO, he wouldn't be moving. I knew his type, pride so deep it calcifies. And right now, he'd be sitting perfectly still, staring at the page, trying to process the fact that the ground under him had just dropped out. That the man he'd let Brandon push out the door now had the power to fire him. Arthur didn't fill the silence. He didn't need to. Every second they spent sitting there, watching their own reflections in that legal language, was a second the truth was rooting itself in their bones. I felt it in my chest, a strange, disorienting mix of vindication and disbelief. For weeks, I'd imagined this moment, but imagining it was different from hearing it spoken aloud, formalized, locked into the official record of a meeting that would go down in the company's history as the day everything changed. Somewhere in that room, someone was already calculating their exit strategy. Someone else was thinking about calling an emergency session without me, not realizing that those days were over. And I stood just outside, feeling the weight shift entirely into my hands. They understood instantly. I was no longer the veteran they'd discarded. I was the controlling shareholder. The man they'd underestimated had just stepped, legally and permanently, to the very top of their world. Arthur opened the boardroom door, and the wave of silence hit me like a wall. All those eyes turned toward me, some wide with shock, some narrowed with calculation, all of them realizing in real time that the narrative they'd been feeding themselves for the past week was now dead. Brandon was there, sitting 2 chairs from the end. The smirk he'd worn the day he fired me was gone, replaced by a tight, bloodless line. His posture had changed too, shoulders hunched, hands clasped so tightly on the table I could see the tendons in his knuckles from across the room. I didn't slow down. I walked straight to the head of the table, the CEO's usual seat, and pulled the chair back. It made a low scrape against the floor that might as well have been a starting gun. I sat, adjusted my jacket, and let the silence stretch. "Let's begin," I said, my voice steady, even. Arthur slid a folder in front of me. The top page was already marked with a bright yellow tab. I opened it, signed where the marker indicated, and slid it to the center of the table. As controlling shareholder, my first order of business is the immediate termination of Brandon's contract, effective today. Brandon flinched like I'd just slapped him. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He looked at the CEO, then the head of legal, searching for someone to step in. No one moved, not a word. Legal counsel kept his eyes on the table. One of the outside directors actually leaned back in his chair, almost amused. "HR will escort you from the building," I added, my tone as neutral as if I were confirming a lunch order. "Your personal belongings will be sent to you." He stood slowly, the weight of the room pressing down on him, and for a second I thought he might try to say something, an excuse, a threat, anything. But he didn't. He just walked out, each step heavier than the last. The door clicked shut behind him, and for a moment the air felt cleaner. I didn't waste time. I pulled another set of papers from the folder, thicker this time, clipped together in a neat stack, and slid them across the table to the CEO. He looked at them without touching them, then up at me, confusion flickering into something darker. "This," I said, "is your termination package." His lips parted like he was about to protest, but I didn't give him the room. I simply tapped the folder once and leaned back, effective immediately. The room went still again, but this silence was different. Not the shocked stillness from before, but the kind that comes when a shift is final, irreversible. The kind that marks the moment everyone realizes they're now playing by someone else's rules. The CEO didn't reach for the papers. He didn't have to. He knew. And in that frozen second, a man who once held the highest seat in this company understood exactly what it meant to be powerless. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. The power wasn't in the theatrics. It was in the fact that they all knew I could do this again to any one of them whenever I chose. No one spoke. Not Arthur. Not the board. Not me. The only sound was the faint hum of the air system overhead, steady and constant, like the heartbeat of a company that now answered to me. Thanks for watching, you cubicle warriors. Hit that subscribe button. Unless you're my old boss, then you're on your own. Revenge of the coffee pot strikes again.